The pod came in without a signal. No distress beacon, no identifying code, no answer to any of the three hails. Harrow's gate sent out before it drifted into the docking clamp range and, locked on by accident, its automated systems running on whatever dregs of power were left inside. The outer hull was scorched black on one side. 3 of its 4 thruster ports were melted shut. Whatever had happened to the ship that launched it, the pod had been flying alone for a long time. Darren Voss was the one who pried the hatch open. He was a station engineer. Not a medic or a soldier, but he was the first one to reach the dock because his workshop was 40 meters down the corridor, and everyone else had to come from farther away. He had a cutting tool in one hand and a flashlight clipped to his collar, and when the hatch gave way with a groan of bent metal, the smell that rolled out was burnt wire and old blood and something else, something animal and warm that he had no name for. He climbed in anyway. There were 2 of them curled in the far corner of the pod, pressed together under a torn thermal sheet. They were not human, he knew that immediately. They were too large for children but too small for adults, and covered in dark green scales that caught his flashlight and turned it back at him in faint flickers. Their wings, still soft and not fully grown, were folded tight against their backs. Their faces were long and angular, with flat nostrils and ridges above closed eyes. They were breathing, barely, but they were breathing. Darren stood still for a moment. Then he stepped back out of the pod and said quietly to the 3 crew members who had just arrived, "Go get Dr. Fenway. Tell him to bring everything. Tell him they're not human, so he should probably also bring his reference library." Dr. Fenway arrived in 4 minutes and spent the first 30 seconds standing in the hatch looking at the 2 figures inside. Then he muttered something to himself that Darren did not catch and climbed in. It took 3 hours to stabilize them. The station did not have medical equipment designed for Dracal physiology, but Fenway was the kind of doctor who read widely and improvised well, and the 2 hatchlings were young enough that some things were still universal: warmth, fluids, rest, and something to eat that would not make them worse. They slept for 14 hours straight. After that, in the small medical bay that Fenway had cleared out and locked from the inside as a precaution, Commander Adeline Breck called a staff meeting that evening. It was a short meeting because there were really only 2 decisions to make. The first was whether to contact the Dracal Empire and inform them that 2 of their young had been found on a damaged pod in the outer rim. The second was who was going to keep an eye on the hatchlings until they woke up. The first decision took longer because the Dracal were not an empire you contacted lightly, and their diplomatic channels with the human reach were formal and slow. Breck sent a message through the correct channels and noted that a reply could take weeks. The second decision was faster because no one volunteered. Darren raised his hand, not enthusiastically, more in the way a person raises a hand when they can see that otherwise nothing is going to happen. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll check on them. Someone has to." Breck looked at him. "They're Dracal, Darren. Even the young ones have claws." "I know, I'll be careful." He was, for the first 2 days, he just left food outside the medical bay door and knocked once and walked away. Fenway told him the most likely things that would be safe for them to eat based on what he could find in his references. And Darren put together trays that smelled strong and had enough variety that something would hopefully appeal. On the 3rd morning, the tray was empty. He took that as progress. On the 5th day, he sat down outside the medical bay door with his back against the wall and a diagnostic tablet in his lap and just worked, not trying to interact, not watching the door, just being there doing his ordinary job. In their vicinity, He did that for 3 days. On the 8th day, the door opened. One of them stood in the doorway, the taller one with the ridge above her. Left eye that was slightly darker than the others. She looked at him, he looked. At her, he did not stand up, because standing up fast seemed like a bad idea. He said, "Hi, I'm Darren. I've been leaving the food." He pointed at the empty tray beside him. "I think you've been eating it, so I'm guessing at least some of it is okay. If any of it makes you feel bad, you can throw it at me and I'll figure out something different." She stared at him for a long time. Then she said something in Dracal that his translator could not parse because it was a dialect too regional for the station's basic language files. Then she went back inside. Darren sat there for a moment, then he went back to his tablet. The next morning, both of them were sitting outside the door when he arrived. He brought 3 trays that time. Over the following weeks, Darren learned their names the way he learned most things, by paying attention. The taller one was Rasha. She said her own name, first pointing at herself, after he had said his name for what he guessed was the 15th time. The quieter one took another week and then said his name, as Soren, while looking at a coolant pipe that Darren was patching, apparently finding the name less significant than the repair technique. They followed him on his maintenance rounds. At first, they just watched. Then Rasha started picking up tools and handing them to him before he asked, which meant she was learning the sequence of what he did. Soren started drawing things. In a small notebook he had found somewhere, detailed drawings of the station's mechanical systems, accurate enough that Darren borrowed the notebook once to check a layout he had forgotten. They learned Galactic Common, the way young things learn language when they have to fast, and with complete disregard for formal grammar. Rasha learned the words for things first. Soren learned the words for questions between them. They covered most of what they needed. Nobody else on the station was unfriendly, but nobody else sat on the floor with them or handed them tools or explained what a pressure valve was and why it mattered. Nobody else was just there, day after day, without making it feel like a thing that required something in return. 2 months in, Soren called him something in Dracal that the translator had finally managed to catch enough vocabulary to render. It came out as the one who stays. Darren did not make a big deal of it, but he did write it down later, in the same small notebook he used for maintenance logs, on a page by itself. 8 months passed. The station got small deliveries, the occasional passing ship, the normal quiet rhythm of a frontier outpost that existed mostly to refuel long-haul freighters and support a 3-person science team studying a nearby gas giant. Rasha and Soren became part of that rhythm. They had their corner of the engineering bay. They had their trays at mealtimes. Rasha had gotten confident enough to argue with Darren about repair methods, which he found genuinely useful because she was occasionally right. Soren had filled 4 notebooks. Then the long-range scanner lit up. Darren was in the engineering bay when the alert came through. He looked at his screen, then looked at Rasha and Soren, who had looked up from what they were doing because they had learned to read the sound of a priority alert the same way they had learned everything else, by being around when it happened. The scanner was showing a ship dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. The ship was large, larger than anything that had any reason to come to Harrow's gate. The ID beacon that came through a moment later was encoded in a format that the station system took several seconds to authenticate, because it was a format used by only a handful of ships in the known galaxy. Personal warships of the Dracal Royal Line. Darren read the beacon ID twice, then he looked up at Rasha and Soren. Rasha had gone very still. Soren had set down his notebook. They knew, of course they knew. They had probably known, somewhere underneath the daily routine of the past 8 months, that this moment was coming, that someone would come for them eventually, that the station at the edge of nowhere was never going to be permanent. Darren set down his own tool. He said, carefully and simply, "She came." Rasha looked at him, not with fear, with something harder to name. "Yes," she said. Outside, the enormous ship was already moving toward the station, slow and certain. The way things move when they have never had a reason to hurry, because nothing has ever been able to stop them. The docking bay had never been cleaned so fast. It was not that Harrow's gate was dirty, it was a working station, and working stations had grease on the floors and cables, along the walls, and the general honest mess of places where people actually did things. But Commander Breck had given the order with a particular tone of voice, and within 40 minutes, 3 crew members had swept, wiped, rearranged, and argued about whether the second docking light on the left was flickering or just dim. It was dim. They changed it. Anyway, the warship did not dock so much as it settled alongside the station the way mountain settles into a landscape slowly, with a weight that made the station's gravity sensors give a small, uncertain reading, as though even the instruments were not sure what to make of something that large choosing to stop there. The docking tube extended, the seal locked, then nothing happened for exactly 4 minutes, which Darren later understood was intentional. The Drackle allowed space for the people receiving them to be ready before they arrived, because arriving before someone was ready was considered a form of disrespect for their own time. He had not known that at the moment. At the moment he was just standing in the bay next to Commander Breck and wondering if he had locked the engineering bay properly. Then the tube door opened. The honor guard came first, 6 of them, each taller than any of the door frames on the station, by enough that they had to angle their heads slightly as they entered. Their scales were a deep blue-gray, the color of deep water, and they wore armor that was clearly not decorative. It was scarred and repaired in places with the marks of actual use. They moved to either side of the entrance with a practiced efficiency that made the station crew stand a little straighter, without quite realizing they were doing it. Then came the herald, who was leaner, with gold-brown scales and a long formal coat that swept the floor, and behind the herald came the translator, a smaller Drackle with a device at their throat that flickered blue each time it worked. And then came the Queen. Darren had seen images of Vel. The station's reference files had several from diplomatic records and historical databases. He had thought he had a reasonable sense of her scale. He was wrong. Photographs did not communicate the way a living thing at that size occupied space, not just physically, but in some other way that had nothing to do with height or wingspan. She moved through the docking bay with the complete certainty of a being who had never, in 10 centuries of life, needed to wonder if she was welcome somewhere. The room simply became about her when she entered it. Everything else became background. She wore no armor. Her scales were the deep green-black of old forest canopy, shot through with veins of dark gold that only caught the light when she moved. Her eyes, when they settled on Commander Breck, were amber and very steady. The translator spoke first. Her Majesty Queen Vel, Supreme Matriarch of the Drackle Empire, Keeper of the Ancestral Line, greets the commander of this station and acknowledges the care rendered to her blood in a time of need. Breck gave a formal nod, precise and respectful. Commander Adeline Breck. Harrow's Gate Station, we are honored by Her Majesty's presence. We've done our best for them. The translator relayed this. Vel listened, then she spoke, and the translator said, Her Majesty thanks you. She requests that her hatchlings be brought to her now so that she may confirm their health before departure. Breck glanced at Darren, not obviously, just the brief sideways look of someone checking a fact. Then she looked back. Of course, Darren Voss, our station engineer, has been their primary caretaker. He can bring them. Darren had not been expecting to be introduced. He gave a small nod when the Queen's gaze moved to him and tried to look like a person who was completely comfortable being looked at by the oldest and most powerful being he had ever been in a room with. He was not comfortable. He was very still in the specific way of a person who is not comfortable and has decided that stillness is the appropriate response. The translator relayed his name. Vel looked at him for a moment, then she said something that came through as, "We thank the caretaker, his service has been noted," the translator added, with a slight additional formality that Darren only later learned was the Dracal custom of formal diminishment, not cruel, simply the acknowledgement of a vast difference in standing, that the Queen's words carried the weight of a gratitude rendered to a lesser but helpful creature. Darren said, "Thank you," because he was not sure what else to say and went to get Rasha and Soren. He found them in the corridor outside the bay, which meant they had already been listening. Rasha was standing straight with her shoulders back and her chin up in the formal posture of a Dracal of her bloodline presenting themselves to a superior. Soren was doing the same, though his grip on his notebook, tucked against his side, was tight enough that the cover had bent slightly. Darren walked alongside them back into the bay. The moment Vel saw them, something changed in her. It was not dramatic, not a sound or a gesture, but the particular stillness that had radiated from her shifted into something else, something less composed and more animal and deeply private. She crossed the bay to them in 3 long strides and lowered her great head close to theirs, and they each touched their foreheads to her jaw in a gesture that was clearly practiced and deeply known, a greeting of bloodline and return. She spoke to them in Dracal, low and continuous, and the translator did not relay it because some things are not for translating. After a moment she straightened. She examined them carefully, thoroughly, the way a parent checks a returned child for damage they might be hiding. She found the healed scar along Soren's left wing joint and touched it with one careful claw. She noted the new weight they had put on, which was good. She noted the way they stood, which was steady. Then she addressed them directly in Dracal, and the translator rendered it. "We depart within the hour. Prepare yourselves," Rasha said, in Galactic Common rather than Dracal, which Darren suspected was deliberate. "Is Darren coming with us?" The translator relayed this. Vel's amber eyes moved to Darren, then back to Rasha. She answered, and the translator said, "The caretaker belongs to his station. You belong with your bloodline. These are separate things." Soren said quietly, "He stayed when everyone else was afraid of us. That counts." There was a pause, not a long one, but the kind of pause that happens when something unexpected has been said, and the room takes a moment to settle around it. Vel regarded Soren. Then she said, and the translator rendered this with careful neutrality, "You have formed an attachment. This is understandable. You were young and frightened and far from home. The attachment will pass." "It has not passed," Rasha said. Vel's expression did not change. She had 10 centuries of practice at an expression that did not change, but something behind her eyes was recalculating. She turned to Breck and said formally that departure would proceed as announced, and that the station's service would be recognized through the appropriate diplomatic channels. Breck thanked her. The honor guard shifted. The herald straightened his coat. Darren walked Rasha and Soren back toward the residential corridor to let them gather the few things they had. It was a short walk when they reached the turn. In the corridor, out of sight of the bay, Rasha stopped. Darren stopped too. She looked at him and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You are going to tell us to go." He said, "She's your family, Rasha. She came all this way." Rasha said, "You are also our family." He opened his mouth, then he closed it. He was trying to find the right thing. To say the practical thing, the kind thing, the true thing. He was trying to say that it was fine, that he would be fine, that Harrow's Gate was his home, and he was good here, and they should not worry about him. Soren looked up at him and said very simply, "You are lying, and you are not very good at it." Darren stood in the corridor for a moment with nothing useful to say. Down in the docking bay, the Queen was waiting. It started with a word. One word in Drackle, spoken clearly in the middle of the docking bay in front of the Queen and her court and 6 honor guards and Commander Breck and 4 crew members who had found various reasons to be nearby. One word that the station's translator did not immediately render because it was older than the standard dialect the translator's files covered, and it took the system 3 full seconds to find it, and when it did, it flagged the translation with a confidence rating of 97% and a note that the term was archaic and ceremonial and rarely used. Rasha spoke it. She stood in the center of the docking bay, not rushed, not defiant, just still and clear and certain, and she said the word in the way that the word was meant to be said out loud before witnesses without hesitation. The Drackle court. Harold flinched. It was a small flinch, quickly controlled, but Darren noticed it. And he noticed that the 6 honor guards had gone very still in a different way than they had been still before. The translator finally rendered it in a flat and careful voice. Right of claimed. Kin invoked. The herald made a sound that did not require translation. Soren, standing beside his sister, said the same word. He said it more quietly than Rasha had, but just as clearly, and the second saying of it was the part that mattered. In Drackle tradition, the rite required 2 voices to be valid, and both had to speak it willingly, and both had to name the same person. The system rendered it again. Right of claimed kin seconded. The name they gave was Darren Voss. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Queen Vel spoke one short word, sharp and flat, and the translator rendered it as, "Explain." It was addressed to her hatchlings. They answered her without hesitation, without apology, in formal Drackle that was more structured and precise than anything they had used in 8 months of daily conversation on the station. Darren could not follow it in real time, but the translator was running a partial relay. And he caught pieces: the emergency pod, the waking up in a strange place, the first days of fear, the door that opened, the trays of food, the maintenance rounds, the months. Rasha spoke most of it. Soren added things when Rasha left gaps, which was not often. Rasha had a memory that was systematic and accurate, and she had clearly been preparing this accounting for some time, possibly since the moment the warship's beacon appeared on the scanner. The translator caught a section and rendered it in full. He did not study us. He did not report us in the way your court was told we were reported. He did not take images of us or ask us questions about the Empire or what we remembered of our escort ship. He fixed a coolant pipe while we watched. Then he moved to the next pipe. We followed. He handed Soren a tool without being asked because Soren was already reaching for it. That was the 3rd day. Another section, when the crew was uncertain around us, he was not. Unafraid, we could tell when he was uncertain, but he came anyway, every morning. He came because no one else did, and he had decided that someone should. Darren was standing a few meters away, listening to this account of his own behavior with the strange, disconnected feeling of hearing yourself described by someone who has been paying closer attention than you realized he had not known. They could see when he was uncertain. He had thought he was doing a reasonable job of not showing it. Vel had not looked at him since the right was spoken. She was looking at her hatchlings. Her expression was the steady, unreadable surface of deep water. And underneath, it was something that moved. The herald had gathered himself enough to speak. He addressed the queen formally. And the translator caught it. The right has been spoken before witnesses, both voices. The named party is present. Majesty, the right is technically valid, but the named party is a pause, weighted with centuries of legal precedent. Being very gently strained, human. Vel said one word. The translator rendered it, I know. The herald tried again. There is no precedent for. Vel looked at him. The herald stopped. Commander Breck, who had been standing quietly with her hands behind her back in the posture of someone exercising an exceptional degree of restraint, said very carefully, I apologize if I'm missing context. What does the right mean, exactly? The translator, looking slightly relieved to have a straightforward question to answer, said, the right of claimed kin is an ancient Dracal custom by which a member of the bloodline formally names an outsider as family. It is legally binding. Under the oldest laws of the Empire, once spoken before witnesses and seconded, it cannot be dismissed or overridden. Even the matriarch cannot set it aside without violating the foundational laws of Dracal succession and kinship, which have governed the bloodline for 4,000 years. Breck processed this. She said, so Darren is now officially family. Under Dracal law, the translator said, with the careful neutrality of someone relaying information they found personally extraordinary. Yes. Breck looked at Darren. Darren looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had climbed into an unknown pod to check on something and was still 8 months later discovering consequences. Then Vel turned and looked at him, not the brief assessment she had given him in the first moments of her arrival, but a real look, the kind that takes in more than surface. She looked at his hands, which were calloused and had 2 faint chemical burns on the left that had healed imperfectly. She looked at his face. She looked at the way he was standing, which was not drawing himself up and not shrinking back, just standing in his ordinary way in his ordinary clothes, in the middle of his ordinary station, having just been named kin to a royal bloodline by 2 dragon hatchlings. He met her gaze. He did not look away, not out of bravery, but because he did not think looking away was the right thing to do in this moment. Vel said something. The translator paused, then rendered it slowly. You came to them when they were afraid. You asked for nothing. Darren said, I asked them not to throw tools at the electrical panels. That was pretty much it. The translator relayed this. One of the honor guards made a very small sound. That might have been something. Vel's expression did not shift, but she was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, something that had been held at a formal distance began to move very slowly toward something else. She had come here with a plan. The plan was simple and orderly, and 10 centuries of authority had made her very comfortable with simple, orderly plans. The plan had not included this. She looked at Rasha, she looked at Soren, she looked at the empty food tray sitting against the wall near the engineering bay entrance, which someone had forgotten to move, and at the small notebook tucked under Soren's arm, and at the way both of them were standing formal, composed, properly royal, and also completely unmoved, in the specific way of young things who have made up their minds and do not intend to unmake them. Vel said nothing for a long time. Then she turned to her herald and said something short and final. The translator rendered it, "Delay the departure, I need to speak privately with the caretaker." The herald opened his mouth. Vel looked at him. The herald closed his mouth and bowed. Breck caught Darren's eye from across the bay and gave him a look that was both apologetic and completely unsurprised, the look of a commander who had long since accepted that Darren Voss had a talent for finding himself at the center of situations nobody had planned for. Darren followed the Queen toward the station's small meeting room, which had been cleaned for the visit and still smelled faintly of the spray goran from the maintenance crew used on the floors, which smelled aggressively of artificial citrus. He hoped the Queen did not have a strong sense of smell. He suspected she did. The meeting room had 6 chairs. Queen Vel did not use any of them because none of them would have held her. She settled instead on the floor near the far wall, which she filled in the way that weather fills a space, not aggressive, just present in every part of it. Her wings were folded back, her tail curved along the wall, and when Darren pulled out one of the chairs and sat in it, he was technically at eye level with her, which he suspected was not accidental. The translator sat in the corner and became as small as possible. Vel spoke. The translator rendered it, "Why did you care for them?" Darren had been expecting a harder question. He said, "Because they needed it. They were hurt and scared, and nobody else was going to do it right then." The translator relayed this. Vel listened. "Then, that is a description of the situation. I am asking about your reason." Darren thought about this. He said, "I'm not sure there's a difference. The situation was the reason." Vel studied him. She said, "Did your government instruct you to care for them?" "No, I mean, Commander Breck approved it, but it wasn't an order. I volunteered." "Were you compensated?" "No." "Did you expect to be?" "No." "Did you believe it would benefit you in some way, socially, professionally?" Darren considered this honestly. "I didn't really think about it. They were in the medical bay and Fenway needed someone to do the follow-up. I offered." Vel's amber eyes did not move. She had the quality of something that had spent centuries learning how to be patient, not with effort, but as a natural state. She said, "You gained nothing. You spent 8 months of your time, your effort, and your station's resources on 2 members of a foreign empire you had no obligation to. I am trying to understand what humans call the motivation for this, because I have been given several explanations by your diplomatic contacts over the years, and none of them have made sense to me." Darren sat back slightly. He was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "What explanations did they give you?" The translator relayed the question. Vel answered, "That humans help strangers out of religious obligation, that your laws require it, that your cultures produce a form of guilt that functions as a social enforcement mechanism, that you are attempting to create debt in others which you can call on later. Some humans, some of the time, probably fit those explanations," Darren said. "But mostly, I think it's simpler than that. It feels wrong to leave someone alone. When they're in trouble and you can help, that's it. It just feels wrong." Vel considered this. Feelings are not reliable guides to action. "No," Darren agreed, "but some feelings are pretty consistent. Most people feel bad when they see something hurt and do nothing, so they do something." "Most people, not all." "Not all, but enough." Vel was quiet. Then she said something that the translator took a moment to render. "Carefully, among the Drackle, action is guided by duty to bloodline, duty to the Empire, and duty to law. These are ordered and clear. A Drackle who acts outside these duties without sanction from the matriarch is acting incorrectly. Regardless of the outcome, your action choosing to help outsiders with no duty To do so, and no sanction from authority, this would be considered irregular. Darren said, that makes sense for a society built around a single clear line of authority. I'm not saying our way is better, I'm just saying it's how we work. Vel looked at him steadily. Do your kind do this often, act outside duty and expectation, for strangers, for no gain? Often enough, Darren said. We're pretty bad at a lot of things. Leaving people alone when they're in trouble is one of the things most of us are bad at. The translator rendered this twice, as though checking its own output. Vel said, you said you would be fine. To the hatchlings in the corridor, you told them to go, that you would be fine. Darren was quiet for a moment. You were listening. The ship hears everything near the docking tube. Would you have been fine? He considered lying. He decided, sitting in a small room with 10 centuries of practiced intelligence watching him, that lying was probably not going to work. And was definitely not worth trying. I would have been okay. This is my station. I know how to be here, but yeah, it would have been different. They changed things here, the rhythm of the place. I'd have noticed the gap. Vel said, they are royal hatchlings. They are the continuation of a bloodline that has existed for 4,000 years. They will one day hold authority over 12 star systems and 400 billion lives. You are aware of this. I know who they are, Darren said. And yet you taught them to fix coolant pipes and pressure valves. Soren got very good at pressure valves. Something moved in Vel's expression. It was not a smile, her face was not built for what humans called a smile, but something shifted in the lines around her eyes. Something that had been held formerly closed opened slightly. She said, they have said things about you that they have not said about any tutor or court attendant in their lives before. Rasha said you were irritating when you were right about something, but pretended you were not sure. Darren said, I'm often not sure. I just also know that being visibly unsure doesn't help anyone fix the problem. Soren said, you never made them feel like a burden. Darren did not say anything to that. There was not much to say. Vel was quiet for a long moment. The ship hummed faintly through the station walls. Somewhere down the corridor, a pressure sensor gave its routine beep. Ordinary station sounds, the sounds that had been the background of 8 months of small daily things that had added up to something neither party had planned. Vel said, I want to understand your kind better. I have ruled for 10 centuries. And I have dealt with many species. Most of them I understand. Their motivations are legible to me. They want land or safety or resources or status. Humans are harder. You do those things too, but you also do this. She paused and the word she used in Drackle was one the translator rendered as the unrequested thing, and I have never fully mapped why. Darren said, I'm probably not the best person to explain my whole species. No, Vel agreed, but you are the one in front of me, and my hatchlings have named you kin, and I think, another pause, that I would like to observe you more before I decide what to do about that. Darren looked at her. Observe me. You, your species, the way you move through the world. I am very old, Darren. Voss, when something surprises me, I find it worth examining. She stood then, straightening to her full height, and the room was very full. She looked down at him with those amber eyes that had seen 10 centuries of everything and said simply, I am going to speak with your commander. Stay close. Then she walked out. Darren sat in the chair for a moment. He looked at the translator, who was still in the corner and appeared to have been holding their breath. Was that good? He asked. The translator thought about this with the expression of someone doing a very careful calculation. In my experience, they said slowly, when the matriarch says she finds something worth examining, that is generally the best possible outcome. Darren nodded. He got up, straightened his jacket, and followed the Queen into the corridor. Breck had dealt with difficult negotiations before. She had handled a fuel dispute with 3 separate cargo companies at the same time. She had mediated a disagreement between her science team and a passing survey crew that had nearly come to something worse than words. She had once talked a panicking engineer down from venting a coolant tank into a sealed section by staying calm and very specific for 45 minutes straight. None of those things had involved a dragon queen in her command room. Vel came in, folded herself carefully around the furniture in a way that suggested she had learned, over a very long life, how to exist in spaces built for smaller beings without making it feel like a problem, and addressed Breck directly. "The right that has been spoken is valid," Vel said through the translator. "I will not move against it. That is not a position I have arrived at with ease. And I will not pretend otherwise. My hatchlings are young, attachments formed in crisis can feel more absolute than they are, but the right is the right. It is 4,000 years old, and it exists for reasons that were considered very carefully by people much older than anyone now living. I honor it." Breck said, "I appreciate that, Majesty." "However," Vel continued, "Darren Voss is a citizen of the human reach. I cannot take a citizen of a foreign power into my empire's care without the formal agreement of his government. To do so would be incorrect." She used a Dracal word that the translator rendered as incorrect, but noted carried connotations closer to dishonorable in the original. Breck blinked. She had been braced for this conversation to be about whether the Queen would acknowledge the right at all. She had not anticipated that the first thing out of the Queen's mouth would be a statement about human rights. She said carefully, "That's yes, that's correct. Darren would need to consent, and we would need a formal arrangement between your empire and the Reach." "Then that is what we will make," Vel said. Breck glanced at Darren, who was standing near the wall. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised by the direction things were going and was now just trying to keep up. Breck turned back to Vel. "Can I ask what the arrangement would look like on your end?" Vel's translator answered steadily. Darren Voss would travel with the court as the formally recognized claimed kin of 2 members of the royal bloodline. This gives him a legal standing within the empire that has no precedent for a non-Dracal, but the law does not specify species as a requirement. He would retain his citizenship in the human reach and have full access to communications. He would not be a subject of the empire, nor a servant, nor a political appointment. He would be what my hatchlings named him, family. The herald, standing near the door, had the expression of someone watching 1,000 years of protocol adapt in real time and finding the experience deeply uncomfortable. He said something to Vel in low Dracal. Vel replied with one word. The herald became quiet. Breck said, "And what would the human reach receive in exchange?" Vel said, "A diplomatic liaison, the first ever offered to a human station or government by the Dracal Empire, permanent, with full trade negotiation rights." The silence in the room was very complete for a moment. Breck, who was extremely good at not showing on her face what was happening in her chest, said, "I see." Because the human reach had been trying, through correct and formal channels, to open any kind of genuine diplomatic dialogue with the Dracal Empire for 60 years of politely worded overtures and very politely worded non-responses, and here was the Queen in her station on the outer rim offering permanent liaison with full trade rights because a station engineer had fed 2 lost hatchlings and taught them about pressure valves. Breck made herself breathe normally and said, "We would need to verify that with the Reach government. It's above my authority to sign that alone. Vel said, obviously, I will wait while you contact them. Breck reached for her communications panel and began composing the most unusual message she had sent in her career. Across the room, Darren was asked by the translator directly and without ceremony, "Are you willing to go?" Darren thought about this for a genuine moment, not a performative moment, not a dramatic pause, but an honest beat of consideration. He thought about Harrow's gate, which he had lived on for 6 years, and which he was good at maintaining. And which was, in the way of things you are good at that have become comfortable. Very easy to stay inside. He thought about Rasha and Soren, who were at this moment waiting in the corridor because Breck had asked them to, and who had stated in front of an empress that he was their family, and who he knew with the plain certainty of 8 months of daily evidence, meant it. He said, "Can I bring my tools?" The translator blinked, relayed this. From the corridor, loudly and clearly enough to be heard through the door, Rasha said, "Obviously." The command room was quiet for a second, and then 3 separate people in it made sounds that were not quite laughter, but were in the general vicinity. Vel said, through the translator, "He may bring his tools." Darren said, "Then yes, I'll go." The formal agreement took 3 more hours. It required 2 calls to the Reach government, which involved, in order, 1 baffled administrator, 1 very senior diplomat who asked Breck to repeat the part about the liaison 3 times, and 1 official approval that came through in record time because someone at the top of the chain had correctly understood that this was the kind of moment that only comes once. The document was brief, clear, and noted in several places that this was genuinely unprecedented. Breck signed it. The herald signed for Vel, who put a formal mark below his that was apparently more significant than any written name, and which made the herald's hands slightly unsteady as he filed it. Darren signed his own section and noted, in the small space for additional remarks, that he reserved the right to fix things that were broken, because that was his job, and he had a feeling the Drackle royal ship had systems he was going to find interesting. Nobody told him to remove this note. He took that as approval. The station crew gathered at the docking bay without being told to. They simply appeared, 1s and 2s, until most of the 40-person crew was there. Dr. Fenway handed Darren a medical kit that was, by any objective measure, comically large. "You're going into an alien empire," Fenway said. "You'll need things they don't have. I included a full reference on your own biology in case their doctors are clever but confused." Goran from maintenance gave him a backup set of tools because Goran was practical. 2 members of the science team gave him a data chip with a compressed library of xenobiology because they felt this was relevant. Someone had made a cake. The cake was pale blue, which was not a natural color for a cake, and the frosting had been applied with more enthusiasm than skill, and it said "Good Luck DAREN" in letters of varying heights. Darren ate 2 slices and said it was the best cake he had ever had, which was not true, but the look on the baker's face made it the right thing to say. Vel watched all of this from near the docking tube entrance. She watched the cake. She watched the medical kit. She watched crew members who had no formal reason to be there, standing in a bay because someone they worked alongside was leaving, and they wanted to be present for it. She watched this with the complete attention of someone filing away something important. She said to her court historian quietly in Drackle, "Record this." The historian, who had been recording it already, simply nodded. The docking tube doors opened. Rasha and Soren went through first, then the honor guard, then the herald. Darren picked up his bag and his toolkit and turned around once to look at the bay full of people from his station. his messy, honest working station and said, "Keep the oxygen recyclers clean, the second filter on port. Junction 14 sticks if you don't clear it every 3 weeks." Goran said, "We know, Darren. I know you know, I'm just saying." He went through the tube. The doors closed behind him. Breck stood in the bay for a moment after the seal disconnected, and the warship began its slow pull away from the dock. She looked at the wall where the docking clamps had been. She looked at the 2 slices of cake remaining on the tray. Then she went back to her command room, because the galaxy was still running and Harrow's Gate still had work to do. But she kept the cake. The ship was called Endless Green, which the translator told Darren was a poetic reference to the color of the deep forests on the Drackle throne world, and also a word that in old formal Drackle meant something closer to what continues after everything ends. Darren thought that was a lot to ask of a color. He also thought the ship was the most impressive piece of engineering he had ever boarded in his life, and he said so out loud on the first morning while standing in the engine observation corridor looking at a propulsion core the size of his entire station. The engineer on duty turned to look at him, a young Drackle, relatively speaking, with copper-brown scales and a guarded expression. Darren had never seen a guarded expression quite like that before, not hostile, just the careful neutrality of someone who does not yet know what category to put a thing in. A human on a royal Drackle warship was not a category that had existed before. Darren said, "The heat distribution on that secondary ring looks uneven. Is that deliberate?" The engineer stared at him. Darren pointed. "There, the left arc runs maybe 4 degrees hotter than the right. Based on the color shift, either that's a calibration choice I don't know about, or something's compensating for an asymmetry in the fuel feed." The engineer looked at the ring, then at Darren, then at the ring again. Then he said something in Drackle that the translator rendered as, "How did you see that?" Darren said, "I've been reading heat signatures off cooling systems for 15 years. You get a feel for it." That was the beginning of the first real conversation Darren had on the Endless Green that was not diplomatic or formal or carefully managed. By the end of the first week, he had been into the secondary engine room twice by invitation, had identified 2 other minor asymmetries that were being monitored but not yet addressed, and had been included in the shift rotation for the informal engineering checks in the way of someone who turns out to be useful and therefore gets absorbed into the work. The honor guard thought this was entertaining. They were large and ancient and professionally serious, and they had a tradition of inviting guests aboard to sparring practice as a form of both hospitality and assessment. Darren went when invited. He lost consistently and completely, and without any apparent damage to his general mood, which was the part they had not expected. Most visitors who lost at sparring became either sullen or overly eager to prove themselves. Darren dusted himself off each time, asked specific questions about the technique he had failed to defend against, tried to apply the answer, failed again, and seemed to find the whole process genuinely interesting. After the 6th session, the guard who had been working with him said, in Galactic common that was careful and slow but real, "You do not mind losing." Darren said, "Losing's only bad if you don't learn anything. I'm learning a lot." The guard considered this. He said, "Most do not think this way. Most people didn't grow up having their older brother beat them at everything for 12 years, Darren said. "You either figure out how to be okay with losing or you spend your whole life miserable. I figured out how to be okay with it." The guard told this to the other guards. After that, Darren noticed that the honor guard, while still formally correct and completely professional in their duties, had a slightly different quality of attention when he entered a room, less wariness. Something more like interest. Rasha and Sorin moved back into their court roles, tutors, formal lessons, the structured education of royal hatchlings, and within this structure they also moved every day through whatever part of the ship Darren was in, not to cling to him, but to stay connected. Rasha would come to the engineering bay and argue with him about a repair. Sorin would come and draw things and occasionally ask questions that were better than the questions Darren had been asked by any engineer in his career. They were still who they had always been. They were just doing it in a bigger world now. Vel did not interact with Darren often, but she watched. He came to understand that this was her way. She let things develop and observed them, and when she had seen enough to form a view, she spoke. She asked him questions in small meetings 2 or 3 times a week through the translator. The questions were always specific and always direct. How did humans decide who led them? How did human families decide when a child was ready to be independent? What did humans do when 2 duties pointed in opposite directions and only one could be followed? He answered as honestly as he could, which sometimes meant saying, "It depends," and sometimes meant saying, "I don't know, people do it differently," and once meant saying, "I think we mostly muddle through and try not to cause too much damage," which the translator rendered with an expression of private amusement that Vel appeared to find telling in some way. The throne world was everything Harrow's Gate was not, green and enormous and layered with 4,000 years of architecture that grew into and around itself. Like something alive, the capital city was built into the side of a mountain range, and the royal halls were inside the mountain itself, carved out and augmented over centuries into something that was both organic and palatial. Darren walked through it with his neck slightly tilted back for the first 3 days because the ceilings were high enough that he kept wanting to look at them. The court was the hardest part, not because anyone was unkind, they were not, which surprised him, but because the etiquette was intricate and specific and the translator could not always keep up with nuance in real time, which meant Darren bowed to the wrong rank several times, called a senior official by the wrong title twice, and on one notable occasion appeared, due to a translator lag, to have agreed to a formal debate on imperial trade law with a court scholar who was renowned for winning formal debates on imperial trade law. Rasha coached him with the patience of someone who found his mistakes deeply predictable and somewhat amusing. Sorin made him a reference guide, handwritten in Galactic Common, organized by situation, arrival, departure, address to a superior, address to the matriarch, address to an official of unclear rank, and a final section titled, "When you are not sure," which said simply, "Bow slightly and say nothing until Rasha tells you what to do." Darren kept the reference guide in his jacket pocket for 6 months. After 6 months, he had internalized most of it. He still kept the guide because Sorin had drawn small illustrations in the margins that were accurate and charming and occasionally a little mean. 2 years after the morning, a pod had drifted into Harrow's Gate's docking clamps. Without a signal, a message came through the diplomatic channel from Breck to Darren. It was short, because Breck was always short when she had something she found genuinely funny. It said, "The liaison your queen sent us has been here 8 months. Attached is their first full trade proposal. I've had 7 people read it and they all say the same thing. These people understand us better than most human negotiators do. The proposal is fair and detailed and somehow accounts for about 15 things we were going to ask for before we asked. How? Explain." Darren wrote back, "She said she wanted to understand us better. I think she meant it. She had a lot of time to watch while we were traveling. Breck wrote back, you were the study. Darren wrote back, I was the first available data point. Don't read too much into it. He did not tell Breck about the morning, 3 weeks after they had arrived on the throne world, when Vel had stopped him in the corridor outside the engineering archives and said, without preamble, that she had spent the past weeks reviewing everything her court historians knew about humanity. She had said, you do not build empires the way we do, you do not last as long individually, you do not have the oldest ships or the biggest fleets or the most ancient laws, but you do one thing that I have not seen another species do consistently, at scale, across cultures. He had asked what that was. She had said, you close distance between yourselves and things that are not like you move toward the unfamiliar rather than away from it, and by this time anyone has noticed, you are already part of things, already woven in. Darren had stood in the corridor for a moment and then said, we don't always do it right. No, Vel agreed, but you keep doing it. That is the part that is interesting. She walked away after that. He stood in the corridor with the sounds of the mountain palace around him, deep and old and enormous, and thought about a docking bay and a bent pod hatch and a flashlight clipped to his collar. That afternoon, he went to the engineering bay, where a team of Drackle technicians were working on a secondary drive component. He pulled up a stool, asked if they needed a second set of eyes on the calibration issue they had been working around for a week, and got to work. Rasha was sitting on a structural beam above the bay, eating something she had found in the palace kitchens that she was not supposed to have, watching with the attitude of someone who had nowhere more important to be. Soren was on a lower beam, drawing the calibration setup in his notebook. Darren said, without looking up, you could help, you know. Rasha said, I am helping. I am keeping you from making the face you make when you are not sure about something but do not want to say so. Darren said, I don't make a face. Soren said, without looking up from his notebook, you make a face. Two of the Drackle technicians across the table looked at each other. One of them said something in Drackle that the translator rendered simply as the human makes a face. Darren looked around the table, then he looked up at Rasha. You told them, he said. Rasha finished her food and said nothing, which was its own answer. Somewhere across the galaxy, in a meeting room that smelled of artificial citrus, a queen had once come to collect 2 hatchlings and found instead a question she had not known to ask. Somewhere in a docking bay, crew members had stood around a terrible blue cake, because that was what you did when someone who had been around long enough mattered was leaving. And somewhere on a throne world built into a mountain, in an engineering bay, surrounded by beings who were older and larger, and in every measurable sense more powerful than he was, a human was fixing something that was broken. Because it was broken, and he was there, and those 2 things had always been enough. The galaxy was still adjusting. It had a feeling it would be adjusting for a while.